Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. This is the latest edition of Drezburt. I am Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, and I write spoiler alerts for the Washington Post.
And I'm Heather Hurlburt, and I run the New Models of Policy Change project at New America. And we have an exciting and fun-packed day for you, which is name that analogy from a previous decade, where Heather and Dan compete to come up with the most arcane analogy of past U.S. foreign policy kerfuffles for present U.S. foreign policy kerfuffles. Dan Drezner, go.
Diet of worms. I don't even know what that is, but that's just always the most obscure thing I can think of.
A really bad diet is what it is.
Yes, there we go. The thing that I was talking about is we are now knee deep in questions about an Iran deal, which I always feel hesitant to actually say because there is no deal yet. There is a framework that still needs to be, negotiated to its completion. But there is, in some ways, another genuine Iran deal, which is that Congress and the Obama administration have now agreed upon, I guess, the Corker bill for the extent to which Congress will be able to review any actual Iran agreement. And here I will defer, Heather, to your comparative advantage in explaining legislative arcana to me and everyone else.
Well, the funny thing is, while on the actual negotiations with Iran, we have a framework and all of the really contentious content needs to be filled in, on the congressional side, we now have a clear roadmap for how things will go, right, to which only the contentious hot air needs to be added. And so one just kind interesting side note for the political junkies at home is that it is the Corker-Cardin bill.
Right.
And for those of you who do not hail from the great state of Maryland, as I do, you may or may not know very well Senator Ben Cardin, who is Maryland's junior senator and ascended to be the ranking Democrat on foreign relations after Senator Menendez had to step down to deal with his little criminal indictment. The interesting thing about this is that it puts a Jewish American senator who is known as very close and a very solid and dependable friend of American Jews and the organized Jewish movement in America, if you will, in this position of trying to triangulate between the Republicans and the White House. Mm-hmm. And the fact that what you came out with is a pretty unambiguous win for the administration for reasons that I will now explain. So,
because you're going to have to do that, because if you read the front page of the New York Times, it was treated as a complete abject surrender by the Obama administration. So I do want to hear your articulation on this.
Yeah, all I can say about that Times article is that the headline writer was insufficiently supervised. But so Congress can pass laws about U.S. foreign policy.
Congress can't pass laws, Heather. Come on. I'm sorry.
Okay. Hypothetically, if Congress could pass anything, it could pass laws about things that the president does in foreign policy. This is pretty undisputed by constitutional scholars. So saying, Congress won the right to oversight. Well, no, Congress had the right to oversight before. If they want to pass a law saying, hey, we have the right to oversight, if I want to go stand on my roof and yell, hey, I have the right to stand on my roof, I can do that, but I'm not filming it for you guys. So yes, Congress won something that it already had. Yay! Number two, Congress set a time frame in which to do the thing that it already had the right to do. That would actually be a huge advance over all the ways that Congress fails to live up to time frames for things that it's supposed to do. Congress established that there will be a high bar needed for it to pass a resolution of disapproval, which is interesting. 60 votes. Remember, how many seats do the Republicans have in the Senate?
Less than 60.
Not 60. Mm-hmm. The one thing which the administration and people who are worried about Iranians backing away from a deal sees as a significant concession is that this deal to let the Congress do what it already had the power to do includes 30 days after a deal is reached in which the administration can't roll back sanctions. Right. Now,
which strikes me as truly trivial, but go ahead.
Yeah, although there's clearly a big issue with the timing of the rolling back of sanctions.
Absolutely, yes.
To switch playing fields for a moment. In Iran, the Supreme Leader has been going around saying all sanctions must be rolled back on day one. And that's clearly not what anybody agreed to. And it's very unclear whether that's a negotiating tactic on his part, a domestic political tactic on his part, whether he really believes it, whether he's decided to scuttle the deal and is going to use that as an excuse. So this is a significant nuisance to the administration, but it's not more than that. And in exchange for that, what went away were a number of amendments that would have kept all the sanctions on until Iran basically reformed all of its other behavior,
right.
Which,
poison pill amendments like the Rubio one that said, Iran would have to recognize Israel's right to be a Jewish state.
Right. Yeah. And that Iran would have to be certified as ceasing all sponsorship of terrorism.
Which they're not going to do, yes.
Right. Let us stipulate here that Iran is appalling on human rights. Iran's record of rhetoric towards Israel has been appalling, and its support for regional terrorism is appalling. All of those things are true.
Yes, good.
Whether this negotiation should have been the implement with which to get at them is what's under dispute here, right. Not like nobody's saying, hey, Iran's a good actor.
Right.
So the administration got rid of the things that would truly have killed a deal, is left with things that shouldn't kill a deal unless, frankly, the Supreme Leader was going to kill it anyway.
Right, exactly.
And Congress loudly proclaims its right to do something it always had the right to do.
Here's my question for you, and this in some ways is related to something I wrote this morning for the Post, which is, the legitimate objection that Congress had during the entire run-up to this, and this is a thing that we've gone back and forth about, is that the Obama administration has been running various aspects of its foreign policy that under ordinary times would have required at least some congressional buy-in without any congressional buy-in. So think about the climate change deal, think about the Cuba opening, and now we get to Iran. My question to you is that with this deal, to what extent now can the administration say, hey, look, you've got congressional buy-in on this. You can't now claim I'm acting, unilaterally or exceeding congressional authority or so on and so forth. Does this actually remove, critics of the Iran deal sort of best lever to sabotage the deal?
Well, so to just go through a number of points.
Okay.
I mean, arguably, if Congress had intended for the administration to not be able to lift Iran sanctions, then it wouldn't have put in executive waivers.
Right.
If Congress had intended for the administration not to be able to change Cuba policy, they wouldn't have included waivers. So this whole notion, I reject on these. So that's just point one.
Right.
But point two is no.
Okay.
The Congress's levers to sabotage the deal are, are overriding or reenacting sanctions or other punitive measures. And what this deal that was reached yesterday makes clear is that everybody knows that Congress is not going to be able to override a veto. And at some points this was in question. People were anxious. Would Democrats hold firm? Would there be so much pressure from groups that are either genuinely or for political purposes so concerned about Iran's the regional threats Iran poses? And I think everybody has now concluded that the answer is no. Nobody thinks either on the substance or the politics it's a good idea to override an Obama veto on Iran. So the ugly little secret here is that Congress, as Congress, doesn't have the ability to quash the Iran deal.
Right. And I guess, but the point is that there are many members of Congress who simultaneously, let me reframe this. There are many members of Congress who simultaneously, A, want to kill the Iran deal, and B, want to be president come January 2017. And a lot of these people have been making the pledge, Rubio is the most recent, that, on day one of their presidency, they will revoke the Iran deal. Now, as you opened by talking about how we're going to come up with foreign policy analogies, the analogy I used, which I just wrote about, is that this reminds me of the sort of outbidding that Obama and Clinton had on NAFTA during the 2008 Democratic primary over who was going to be harder in terms of renegotiating NAFTA. Now, clearly that renegotiation never happened. But that said, NAFTA is on a stronger legal footing in some ways than the Iran deal would be, because NAFTA was a genuine congressional executive agreement, and so it's not, you can't just willy-nilly rework that. So I guess the question to ask is that if there is a Republican president in January 2017, and you have to accept that premise, what are the odds that you think they will actually revoke the deal on day one?
So a Republican president will convene his national security advisors, who will include people like Steve Hadley, who was national security advisor second term for Bush, Bob Zellick, who very badly wants to be Secretary of State, whoever the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is at the time. This one will be replaced, and before then, and we don't yet know which of two candidates it'll be. And those people will sit down, and they will have to do two things. One is they will have to go talk to the allies and say, okay, guys, if we were going to massively reimpose sanctions, what would they be?
Right.
What can you help us deliver? And number two, okay, let's check out what our military options are, and let's remind ourselves what we could accomplish.
Right.
And when that group of people who are not insane sit down.
I might write this as a stage play, by the way. I would love that. That's a fun stage play to write. Go ahead.
They will find the same thing that George H.W. Bush's team found, that Bill Clinton's team found, that George W. Bush's team found, that Obama's team found. They will find that the calculus does not make sense for anything other than a negotiated solution and as much pressure as you can get the allies to bring to bear. Mm-hmm. So they will not revoke the deal on the first day. My prediction of what they will do is come up with some new terrorism-related sanctions, which look suspiciously like the old sanctions. Much of the rest of the world won't go along with it. And then the interesting question is, will that make Iran decide it's in its interest to break the nuclear agreement, or will Iran decide, no, it's in its interest to keep the nuclear agreement and ramp up on other channels, which, by the way, if what Iran chooses to do is ramp up on terrorism, that's going to be quite damaging for all the regional interests that we say we're doing this to protect. But that's what I think will actually happen.
I tend to agree with you. Well, let me rephrase that. I think in some ways what the GOP candidates are doing here, I mean, this is the ultimate in cheap talk, but I think the reason they're doing it is because they genuinely do not think that Iran is going to adhere to the terms of the deal. They think that this is something they can talk about now because it's May of 2015, whereas by January 2017, either a deal does not come to fruition, which I still think there's a 40% chance that there is no deal. But
at least 40.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe
I'm sorry. I was actually 60% chance that I thought there was a 60-40 chance that a framework would be signed and a 40-60 chance the deal would be completed. But even if the deal is reached, that Iran will so blatantly violate it that the case to be made for snapping back sanctions will be strongly in place. So I tend to agree with you that what's going on here is that their calculation is they will never actually have to be put to this pledge. Which is why, therefore, part of me really, really wants there to be a deal and the Iranians to actually comply with it, just to see what happens at that moment.
Well, I disagree a little bit with you on what I think the presidential candidates are thinking, in part because, I mean, if you follow Iran at all, which admittedly most of the candidates don't, but they have smart people working for them who do, Iran's not going to blatantly cheat. Iran is going to push every envelope it can push and play around the edges, but Iran is not going to do something that the whole world regards as blatantly cheating. That is my prediction number one. Prediction number two, the people who are irrevocably ideologically opposed to a deal, not the ones who are doing this primarily for political advantage, but the people who are, it's not so much that Iran would cheat on the deal as that they don't think any deal you could get with Iran would constrain Iran.
No, I actually think it's worse than that. I mean, as I've written before, I think for them, the scariest scenario is that Iran actually complies with the deal.
You saw the reporting out of the Israeli press that the Prime Minister Netanyahu said that in a cabinet meeting last week,
and the awesome thing is I said that before him, so I was very, very pleased that I called this one. But yeah, that essentially because to be fair, from their perspective, the concern is they will comply with the deal, which means for 10 years they will not develop any, they will not make any progress towards, or they will not, make any tangible progress towards developing a nuclear weapon. They will get to do two things, though, that are really important. First, they will suddenly become much richer because the sanctions will be lifted, which gives them all sorts of resources to do everything in the region that they want to do. And second, there are some ways in which they can still, accelerate research and development so that they don't need all the really old school centrifuges, but they can actually use new school centrifuges once the deal ends, and therefore 15 years from now, they are sitting pretty.
So I think a thing that people have been unwilling to come to terms with is that the international community cannot and will not actually stop any state from getting right up to the threshold.
Yeah.
And the combination of that fact plus the fact that Iran has at various times had a program means that there isn't anything that can be done. There isn't an outcome that takes Iran back to having the nuclear capability of
1995.
Tonga.
Yeah. But all right, so let me ask you this, Heather. A lot of the GOP rhetoric, and this gets embodied in like the Kissinger-Schultz op-ed from last week, is this is still all awful. That, if you take a look at what the negotiating position was of both the Obama administration and, for that matter, the Bush administration before it, what we are now agreeing to is just awful, and therefore this is just a demonstration of weak-willed appeasement by the United States.
It's a demonstration of a world in which the United States can't unilaterally impose its will to that extent, and Kissinger of all people should know that. It was that op-ed was very interesting in that it was two guys who, in some ways are two of the best, if not the best, practitioners of realpolitik as Secretary of State, sort of backing away from things that they've said and supported in the past.
Including a 2013 Wall Street Journal op-ed.
Yes. So I think, both of them, and again, trying to be both good political foot soldiers and good realpolitik practitioners, they led themselves to a fairly embarrassing place. Because, there are people who believe what they laid out in their most recent op-ed. It just doesn't happen to be consistent with what they have said they believed for years leading up to, this is the agreement that they were calling for in 2013 and previous. So
I think that the fundamental problem with the op-ed is not, I think all of their criticisms are actually correct. In that, if you take a look at what the status quo will be if this deal comes to fruition versus what was desired, let's say 10 years ago or 20 years ago, it's not necessarily better for the United States. The problem is that they actually offer nothing in the way of an alternative, to that, because as you point out, there really is no alternative. The only thing you can do is to offer something more of a regional strategy to counter what Iran will inevitably do with whatever resources they get from lifting the sanctions. And that, I think, is a valid point. Now, that's where I think the debate should move towards. But
well, I'm not even sure. One thing I will point out that you could do if you weren't two Republicans making that line of critique is you could point out the years and credibility and attention that were lost by deciding to focus on Iraq, where there wasn't a nuclear program, as opposed to Iran, where there was. But, they can't do that.
Right.
And it doesn't help you. That's a nice rhetorical point, but it doesn't help you practically anyway.
Yeah.
I think one should consider, so we don't know how much of the sanctions relief will go into regional power hunting. The Iranian people are under the impression that the sanctions relief is going to go into improving their miserable, crappy economy and making jobs for the millions of educated young people who don't have jobs.
Right.
So I'm not so naive that I think none of the sanctions relief will go towards it, but this is going to face the Iranian regime with some difficult and interesting choices. And we should remember, as a lesson of political science, that it's when regimes start to get more money and popular expectations rise that they're at their most vulnerable. So we shouldn't assume that the results of sanctions relief will be sort of everything stays the same inside Iran and regional mayhem increases on a one-for-one basis. It's likely to be a lot more interesting than that.
I agree with that, although on the other hand, as the president said, the one thing that you cannot expect from this agreement is that there will be anything in the way of a real fundamental change in the regime's attitude towards the United States or the rest of the region. Yep. And, to borrow from microeconomics, in some ways, what's going on here is an income effect, which is the lifting of the sanctions will allow the Iranian regime to devote more money to butter and guns, is what I would say. I think you're right. It's not like they're going to pocket everything they get from this and, just spend a lot on sort of regional revisionism. But in some ways, the counter to that is they've managed to engage in some significant regional revisionism, in part because of U.S. own goals, but also while under heavy sanction. Just give them more resources, they'll be able to do that even more. And so, I take your point about they're not going to pocket all those gains and apply towards that, but they're going to pocket some of those gains and apply towards the region. So I do think a response is worth thinking about.
Yes, but at the same time, just to think about that, they're going to have a huge increase in domestic expectations as a result of this.
Yeah,
which they're going to have, their regime is going to have to figure out how to contain, because there's no way they can meet those expectations.
Right. No, this will be particularly with oil prices the way they are, and particularly the fact that if this has ever actually to come to fruition, oil prices would go down. So, and also it'll take Iran forever to gear up its oil production. But yes, these are all interesting questions, but we are running out of time, and so I think we might want to segue to our next topic.
Right. So I think, speaking of massive expectations and sanctions being released, it's worth noticing that we just, spent 20 minutes talking about a bill to talk about the future of sanctions, where yesterday we had a really significant move on Cuba with its being taken off the terrorist list. Mm-hmm. And although there were yelps of outrage from the usual quarters, it's really worth noticing how relatively little attention that got. Mm-hmm. The sky did not fall. There were not protests in either Miami or Washington. The U.S. critical infrastructure is all still intact this morning, which, 10 or 15 years ago, this was something that you couldn't even really think about doing. And it's just worth pausing a moment to say, hey, whoa, something really changed. And as far as hemispheric politics and hemispheric perceptions of the U.S. and how the U.S. is able to be a regional actor, this is a big change for the better.
I would tend to agree with you. I certainly support the opening to Cuba. I think, to be fair, there is a way in which a lot of people are sort of trying to lump Cuba and Iran together, and I don't think that works terribly well. Because Iran actually is, in many ways, a very dangerous regional actor, and considerably more powerful. Whereas, Cuba is, clearly not a sponsor of state terrorism at this point. And I don't know if they have been for some time. And, in some ways have been fading as the sort of ideological lodestar in Latin America. So what this does is it removes a major irritant to U.S. foreign policy in Latin America, or perhaps, unfortunately, that irritant has simply been substituted, that rather than Latin Americans bitching and moaning about Cuba sanctions, they will now bitch and moan about Venezuelan sanctions. Although I would point out that on that front, the Latin Americans do not have – I don't think the sanctions were a great idea, but on the other hand, the Latin American handling of the Maduro regime has also not been covered in glory.
Couldn't agree more. So we then, just having duly noted that things actually occasionally do change, mm-hmm. And large things do change, and when they change, it's as often with a whimper as with a bang. We go back to something we alluded to before, which is the 2016 presidential elections. And, we talked about Iran sanctions in terms of, and I didn't say this explicitly, so I will now. The other thing that is perfect about the way this bill came out of the Senate on Iran is that it sets up all those senators who are running for president with endless opportunities to get in front of the cameras in June and subsequently and denounce the agreement. Mm. And so we will see among the various senators who are running for president competitive negotiating with Iran denouncing, which is convenient in June since the GOP debates start, are you ready, in August.
Oh, I didn't even know that. That's good to know. Okay.
Yeah. So, either set your TiVo or find an island with no media coverage, your choice. This week, of course, we also had Hillary Clinton and Marco Rubio entering the fray. Rubio on Cuba it's fascinating that mm-hmm. you didn't see that get more play even among Republicans who are running for the presidential nomination, in part because there's such a generational divide on how Americans, Hispanic Americans, and even Cuban Americans feel about
Although
Cuba.
He's come out pretty hard against the Cuba opening, right? I mean, that's everything I've read suggests that, yeah.
But there's not a ton of,
Oh, the other GOP candidates are not outbidding him on that, is your point.
Right. GOP candidates who don't play in that lane are not playing in that lane. Right. People don't feel, whereas Scott Walker feels a need to play in the ISIS lane. Scott Walker does not feel much of a need to play in the Cuban lane.
Right. And on Iran, they've really been outbidding each other. So I think that's a fair point. It backs up your other point, which is that to be fair, the GOP candidates are treating Cuba in a different way than they are treating Iran.
So, but that it leads to a bigger point that I wanted to get to, that you have a really interesting sort of perfect storm coming in 2016 of, on the one hand, the GOP, it's very much in the GOP candidates' interest to pick up national security and use it as a political issue as early and often as possible, both because they're desperate for things to differentiate themselves from each other, and because we've seen the loss of most of the Obama gains in public perceptions of Democrats on national security. So you're sort of back in the Republicans are the daddy party, Dems are the mommy party mode. And when you add to that you have a woman frontrunner and a very high number of Democratic women running, certainly in the Senate and also in the House, that the temptation, not temptation, the certainty that you're going to be playing gender security politics is very high. And I have a piece in the American Prospect this week pointing out what gender security politics look like, which are that when women voters, number one, when women voters feel anxious, they vote on security issues, not on gender issues. So trying to get women to vote for a woman candidate or on social justice, war on women type issues doesn't work as well when people are anxious, rightly or wrongly, about having their heads cut off by ISIS.
Or getting Ebola.
Or getting Ebola. And second, when you raise the threshold of national security anxiety, there is a non-trivial part of the American voting public which still sees men better positioned than women to be national security leaders. And
well, that's just science, Heather, okay? I'm sorry, go ahead. You would reach across the internet and bash my head right now if you could. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that.
To show that I'm just as good at violent solutions as you are.
Ooh, touche.
Thank you for setting that up for me so nicely.
That was lovely. Okay, go ahead.
And actually, the point, this applies on Hillary Clinton is in a category by herself on this. The woman has dedicated 20 years of her life to proving that she can deal with your security better than any guy you know, and she gets higher ratings than all the GOP contenders do on security. So in some ways, this is less about her personally and much more about the effects down ticket. But there's the potential for a really significant effect down ticket. It doesn't have to be that way. I think Hillary shows you that. I think Jean Shaheen shows you that from the last go-round. It doesn't have to be this way, but if you get the thing you always get of, oh, this isn't really a national security election. Oh, that's not what the public's really concerned about. Then you are walking into a gendered trap.
Okay, let me ask you 3 questions based on this. The first.
Pardon me and my sinus infection, by the way. I'm so sorry. I'm sure they won't be able to edit that out. Okay. And it'll be an awesome gift.
There we go. So the first question is whether the extent to which you're obviously right that Democrats will need to have a national security plank / response and so on and so forth. But there are a lot of people, despite all the polling that shows that foreign policy is supposed to be really important. I think Byron York actually had a good piece in the Washington Examiner arguing, look, that's actually not going to be the main issue as in the 2016 presidential campaign. It's still going to be the economy. And that perhaps there might be a danger in focusing too much on foreign policy as opposed to economic issues, which it should be pointed out in Hillary Clinton's rollout video was entirely about economic issues and absolutely nothing about foreign policy, which which a lot of people sort of raised an eyebrow on, which was interesting. The second question I would ask you is, to what extent has it surprised you that Hillary Clinton has actually been – I was expecting Hillary Clinton to sort of triangulate between the Obama administration's dovishness on a variety of policies and the GOP's sort of uber hawkishness on a variety of things. And what surprised me, at least on the Iran deal, is the extent to which Clinton has actually been pretty supportive, clear-cut supportive of what the Obama administration has been doing. And to what extent is that a problem potentially for the sort of national security trap that the gender security trap that you're talking about? And the last question is thinking about things like the Ebola panic, for example, of 2014. To what extent can Democrats, in response to this, point out the dangers of panicking just as much as the actual dangers of things like ISIS and Ebola? Or is that not an effective response, as someone who is a total campaign novice on this stuff?
So back to your point one.
Okay.
The way to think about it is not, oh my God, national security is going to be the number one issue in this campaign, because it's not. The way to think about it is you've got to have not just a response, but you've got to have a reassurance that you lead with.
Right.
Basically, I am focused on the idea that there are real dangers out there. I'm not naive about that. I will keep you safe. And now let's talk about the economy. Literally like that. A related point is...
I'm sorry, I have to it's interesting because that's in some ways a reverse of the way Obama talks about it, which is he always says national security starts at home. We have to talk about our economy. Go ahead.
But even by saying that, you've acknowledged that you think there is such a thing as national security.
Okay, fair enough.
Care about it. It's already better than a whole campaign in which you don't mention it until someone asks you about it in a debate, which happens in a distressing number of congressional races that I have seen over the years.
Fair point. Okay.
The other point to make is that the way our brains are wired, we don't have a separate neuron for national security anxiety and a separate neuron for economic security anxiety.
We just have anxiety.
Yeah, as you know, from having school-age kids, we just have anxiety, yes. Period. So it's not the most helpful thing in the world to think about the two as entirely separate, because our rat brains are not experiencing them as separate. And I'm sure I've said this on here before, so I apologize to listeners, but there's this fabulous, set of focus groups that were sponsored by Walmart. And basically the women that they were focus grouping came in with the same level of security anxiety every month. And every month, whatever was at the top of the news was the thing they were anxious about. So we're living in an anxious age, and you have to plan into that. And both your economic campaigning and your national security campaigning have to figure out how to acknowledge it.
How to acknowledge it without exacerbating it, or right. Depending on if you're a Democrat. Yeah.
That lets me skip to your fourth question. So the way to deal with it is not to say, oh, you shouldn't be anxious because you're more likely to die from a fall in your bathtub. Right? Mm-hmm. Even though that is totally true.
Yes.
But the way to deal with it is to say, look, I get that people are anxious. It's hard to watch the news these days. The real risks we face are X and Y, and here's what I want to do about them. Now, I will note that there is another approach which Scott Walker is adopting, and which I think is very smart, although totally wrong on the merit. Scott Walker gave a speech in which he said, the problem with Americans is they don't feel safe, and our national security policy needs to do things that make them feel safe.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the problem is your anxiety, and we're going to
respond to your anxiety, whether it's based in rational calculation or not.
Or not, right. Yeah. So, if you're afraid of, if you're afraid that the Game of Thrones people are going to attack you, we're going to build walls around all our cities, right? Even though that's, clearly not.
Look, that is a jobs program, is all I'm saying.
Okay. So you can talk about it, but not by telling people, look, you're really dumb to be worried about ISIS right. coming here and cutting your throat, right? Because they don't care about your mall. They only care about malls people have heard of before. So then you had a third question that I don't remember what it was.
Hillary Clinton, and the extent to which she has actually been not differentiating herself all that much from the Obama administration on foreign policy.
Oh, on Iran. Yep. Well, look, it's a loser argument to get into, right? First of all, if you're out there trying to explain how you're different, you're losing. As long as you just want to stay off the topic. Mm-hmm. And specifically on Iran, public opinion supports an agreement. You even get a decent number of Republicans who support the idea of a negotiated solution. Yeah. So they're looking at public opinion and they're saying, this is not a fight we have to have,
okay. Which actually then gets to the next question, which is, as we said, she hasn't talked about foreign policy, in the video. And I am wondering how this plays out in the presidential campaign, because there are two different ways I can think about it. The first one, and I think you've seen the same polling on this. I don't want to say it was the Washington Post, that showed that what, Americans seem to value a fair amount now is actually experience. And so despite the sort of message that Rubio and others have talked about, which is that Hillary's time has come and gone, that she will, the one thing she can bring to the table compared to any of the GOP candidates, is, look, I've got executive branch experience. I've got legislative experience. This is someone who has been in the policymaking mix for the last 20 years, as you say. But on the other hand, the other attack line that I'm increasingly hearing, and that you will hear, I think, ad nauseum for the rest of the campaign, is name one country, besides Myanmar, where U.S. relations have improved, under the Obama-Clinton regime. So, and using the sort of Karl Rove dictum of you attack a candidate based on his or her strengths, they're going to go hard after Clinton on foreign policy, and how will she be able to respond?
So the first thing to say is, if you listened to the sort of the campaign message as it was rolled out in Iowa yesterday, it's 5 points. The first 4 are basically pulled directly out of that video, and the 5th one was, I'm running to keep Americans safe from the threats we face today and the threats we face tomorrow.
I thought she was promising free Chipotle for everyone. This just shows how badly I've been paying attention.
You don't listen carefully
enough.
I've told you. You got to listen to the last point. So you can see that the campaign has thought through how to introduce that. Now, the thing that's disappointing for wonks like you and me is, do they want it to be the first, second, third, or fourth thing that reporters are reporting on? No, they don't. And part of that, frankly, is because they know that Rove is dying to go after them on it. So they're going to try, on the one hand, to give the message to voters, I'm strong, I'll keep you safe, but also not offer up targets.
Right.
Now, at some point, that's not going to work, and you're going to have to go out and say, this is my record, and I'm proud of it. But very much the calculus for them is, don't give, elections are not won. This election is not going to be won or lost on national security. It is not in her interest to lead with it. Everybody already knows she's tough, they figure. So they're not gonna, they feel that putting her up there already sends that message, and so they're not, maybe to the despair of you and me who want more excuses to talk about our issues. The medium is going to be the message with her on national security, at least for a while.
Okay.
And on that note.
Yes, on that note, unfortunately, we need to get going, but Heather, a pleasure as always. I hope you share, once again, our bipartisan hopes that the Red Sox will have a very successful season this year. And I do apologize for them spanking the Nationals the last 2 games.
Yeah, I just increasingly feel that the Nationals' predicament, if you put a bunch of extremely talented people in a space and watch them behave stupidly,
it's kind of like Washington, actually. It's actually a perfect symbol for all of Washington, because God, that was an ugly game yesterday.
It's one in a, so I've been keeping track. I'll pause with this. The good news is that the New York Yankees as a team still have more errors than Ian Desmond as an individual player. That's how bad things are, ladies and gentlemen, or how good things are if you're a Red Sox.
No, I was going to say, so the Red Sox play the Yankees and they've played the Nationals. And seriously, the Red Sox defense was not great last year. And there have been a couple of errors this year, but my God, compared to the teams we've been playing, this has just been like watching Little League games. So,
I have a baseball and national security anecdote to close out.
Okay, that's good.
So, I went with my family to the Yankees home opener, which, was a lot of fun. Tanaka got spanked. The Blue Jays won. And, my husband had to drag after my son sort of loudly pointed out that people around us were using the F word. And a guy behind us sort of went from just the Blue Jays to sort of just real crudity about Canada. And I just got really tired, and I turned around and told him to shut up.
Ooh.
And, my husband then had to drag me away before I could follow up by saying, since I observed that you were just standing up respectfully during the Salute Our Veterans segment, are you aware of the relative casualty proportions to populations that the Canadians took in Iraq and Afghanistan? And my husband's like, no, we're going home now, come on. So that's what happens when you let foreign policy geeks go to international sports.
Foreign policy and sports ball clearly do not mix. All right.
Okay, Drezner, till next time.
Till next time, Hurlburt.